Hello, lovely people. Welcome back to another episode of Masculinities with me, Lewis Wedlock. I'm really excited to be with you today. I'm really excited to provide you with, again, another short episode that speaks to something that I'm actively experiencing more and more in the space at this moment in time. And I want to preface this episode by saying, please hear my heart on this. I am not approaching this episode from the vantage point or from the perspective of poor me, like I'm really under it right now. This is not what it is. This is me offering analysis and exploration of what I'm seeing and what I know based off of speaking with and conversing with many peers within the space too. We're seeing a lot more of in relation to specific conversations around masculinity and also specific conversations about violence against women and girls. Now, if you're tuning into this episode for the first time and you're going, well, this podcast is called Masculinities with Lewis Wedlock, and we're talking perhaps a little bit in this episode about violence against women and girls. Where's the link? What's going on? Well, the link is that in this space and in this context, when we're talking about violence against women and girls, the data picture globally is that violence against women and girls is something that is disproportionately committed by men. So it is something by extension that applies itself to the masculinity conversation and dialogue. But what's really fascinating to observe in spaces, whether that's Instagram, TikTok, even LinkedIn and other sort of social platforms, is that when you mention masculinities, when you mention masculinities linked to violence against women and girls, misogyny and sexism, there is an overwhelming knee-jerk response of, yeah, but not all men though, Lewis, right? Not all men though. I think that's important to center the conversation, Lewis. It's not all men. So like I would politely just ask to, be specific in terms of what you're talking about. It's not all men. Not all men are bad. I mean, we need to be really clear on that in the discussion. Now, let me explain from my perspective why I think this approach is actually, in the long run, a lot more harmful and a lot more disingenuous in the conversations and the actions and the interventions that we're having. It's specific reference to misogyny, sexism, and violence against women and girls. It should be commonsensical in the space that we're not speaking to all men as a universal generalization. But what we are seeing in response to the invitation for accountability, for reflection, from embodied participation of all men, we're getting this kickback. Yeah, but it doesn't apply to me because not all men. And I think this is a really interesting point to explore and examine because often a lot of the labor in this conversation is not spent talking about the realities of misogyny, sexism, and violence against women and girls. It's spending most of the grapple trying to convince men and boys why their participation is needed, why their participation is massively important in the cultures and communities that we're looking to build. We're so afraid of offending the sort of population of men through the purpose of generalization than actually speaking to the realities of misogyny, sexism, and violence against women and girls. And if more men are offended at the generalization of being grouped in a sort of phrase of all men, or all men are involved in this conversation, they're more offended at being grouped in that space than they are offended at the realities of harm committed by men. We need to name that and center that instead of going, okay, actually, it's right. Okay, it's right. It's not all men. It's not you. And it's not you either. We're just talking about a very select few men and boys in the conversation. And actually, as a result of that, we're just going to move past the reality that what we're speaking to here actually needs to be actually not involving you at all. So actually, you know what? The session's done. The session's done. This, for me, as I said, in the long run, is not only harmful, but disingenuous. Because if we say to men and boys, it's not you, you're excused, then what we do is we create an opportunity to opt out of gender equity conversations. We create an opportunity to say, well, it isn't me, so it doesn't apply to me. And if it doesn't apply to me, then in apathy, we can allow harm to continue to occur unchecked, unchallenged, as normal. This is why I think we need to be really intentional with how we set up these conversations. Because from my lens, from my perspective, what we've got at this point in time is a cultural context that's more concerned with upsetting men and boys, or more concerned with centering men's feelings in the conversations about women's reality, or realities, I beg your pardon, we're more focused about we don't want to offend the guys and the boys, when really what we're speaking to in this conversation is the realities of women and girls. This is something that should take precedence in this conversation. And where masculinity is concerned, we need to be able to have the nuance and the conceptual range to have that conversation with boys and men when this comes up. To go, it might not be you who is committing these acts of harm, but it likely is you that doesn't see a problem when it comes up. It is likely you that might not challenge those behaviors because it's got none of my business. It's likely to be you that might look the other way because it's a bit uncomfortable. It's likely to be you that might opt out of the conversation because you've been given that space and place to do so. It might be you that just goes, it's got nothing in this space of influence for me. It's not my friends, it's not my peer group, it's not my community, so I'm out. That isn't all men conversation. It isn't all men committing harm in the most violent and oppressive contexts and scenarios. But all men in the cultures that we exist within are in proximity to those ideas and beliefs. That is why this conversation includes all men. That is why we need to have that space to be able to contextualize that in conversation. That is why having that space and time to explore that, have that conversation, examine that is massively important. Because what we do not challenge, what we do not contextualize, we compound. And I cared too much about the future generations of masculinity and the proximity to ideas of harm, even if they're not enacted, the ideas that they, are in proximity to, it's just boys being boys, it's just the cheeky chappiness or, women always overreact and it's always women that are in their feelings about X, Y, and Z. And that type of thinking that doesn't get challenged and, explored because we're afraid of, that dysregulation and that uncomfortability is something we need to name. And it's something we need to explore in future work. Because as I said, this work is too important to not name that in conversation. This work is too important to not bring this in to the work that we're doing. Men's feelings or uncomfortability should not take precedence over the realities of harm committed against women and girls, which when we're looking at the data is disproportionately overwhelmingly men. We need to be able to bring that into discussions instead of skirting around it to keep the peace in those spaces. Because what we do not challenge, what we do not contextualize, we compound. So I just wanted to get that off my chest because I'm seeing it a lot. And I know that there are many professionals in the space that feel very similar to myself. And for me, moving forwards, this is where the real focus needs to be in the wider conversations with boys and men in the context of schools. So those are some of my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Share it with your people if you feel like there's some things in here that they could hear and listen to. I say all of this from a position of love and care, and from a genuine, desire to help in the spaces. And this isn't the perspective. This is a perspective in a larger conversation. But I needed to bring some of my perspectives into the space today. So I hope you find this episode useful. Big blessings to you, and I'll see you in a future episode very, very soon. Bye bye.